Let's talk about invasive species. This is a growing problem in the world, and it's one that certainly most countries are very aggressive about trying to prevent. So, like when you get off a plane and you come to customs, they want to know if you have any living organisms with you because some of them are notorious for becoming a problem as if they become an invasive species in a new location. So, let's just learn about that. So, invasive species are a subset of something else called an introduced species. So, introduced species, this is something that humans have been doing ever since we started traveling the globe. And that basically means when humans move to a new location, we sometimes bring organisms with us, plants or animals that we want for some reason. And so we bring them to this new area where they didn't evolve, uh, but they can get by. So, a classic one is crop plants, for instance, say tomatoes and sweet potato. Is it guguma? I forget what it is. My wife loves these things. They're both native. They evolved in Central and South America, but people love them, so they've moved them all over the world, and they do fine. Okay, meat. People like protein, and so when people travel, like when Europeans came to the Americas, for instance, they're like, I really like cows. I like beef, so they just brought them with them. And you know what? The beef can adapt to the grass in one continent as well as in the other one. Pets, people like to have pets, and so tropical birds are a classic example of an introduced species. So people like parrots, and they bring them to other countries. They're mostly from they're from all over the world, but a lot of them we see are from Central and South America. Tropical fish are another good example of that. And then sometimes for pest control, so there are times when people say we have a problem with a particular animal, and we know in another part of the world there's an animal that preys on it. So why don't we just introduce that animal to our island? Classic example is the mongoose was introduced to islands in the Pacific to get rid of snake populations, and it was effective at that. But was it a good idea? We'll see. An invasive species is a subset of an introduced species. So an invasive species is one that gets introduced, but then what happens is it not only adapts to that environment, it reproduces quite rapidly, and at a certain point, it gets to a certain size, it doesn't have any natural predators because it didn't evolve there. So normally, when organisms are evolving, there's this constant coevolution of prey and predator. So as the prey adapts new ways of not getting eaten, the predator adapts new ways of accessing that prey. So there's this coevolution that happens, and that keeps the population of both predator and prey in check. But what happens is with an invasive species, this organism ends up in a place where there's just no predators that have evolved to eat them, so they go out of control. The problem with invasive species is they can cause very significant environmental and economic harm. And so that's why they're so stringent at border crossings to make sure you don't have any organisms that might become invasive. So, in order to become an invasive species, let's just be clear, you have to be adapted to be able to access food and reproduce, like be able to nest in your new environment, and be free of predators. So not have any natural predators in your new environment that are going to keep your numbers in check. And unfortunately, this happens all too often. So let's just look at two counterexamples. We'll start with a parrot. Sorry, I threw it clear. Okay, if a pet parrot escapes, and I've been in a number of places where this happened. I've seen them in Athens, I've seen them in San Francisco, seen them in Rome. So what happens is people get parrots from, say, South America or Australia, and they have them as pets, and they get loose, or they get released. People are like, I don't want this parrot anymore. I'm just going to let it go because I don't want to kill it. Bad idea. But they let it go. And what happens is this. They might be introduced, but they don't become invasive for a couple of reasons. They're not very good at accessing the food in their new environment. Their beaks are designed, they've evolved to be specific to a particular kind of nut, and that nut doesn't grow in their new environment. So although they can eat what's there, they're not highly adapted to it. It's not really quite their niche. The other thing is that parrots, like certainly this one here, the scarlet macaw, that people love, it's a native of Central and South America. They make their nests in old growth trees where holes have formed between branches. That's where they make their nests. Well, guess what? In most places, they don't have this kind of trees to nest in, so it's kind of hard for them to reproduce. And then the other thing is that there are predators that can eat them. So there are snake species and bird species like hawks that will prey on them in these new environments, and that keeps their numbers in check. So although they're introduced and although they're breeding in the wild, their numbers stay low. Their carrying capacity is not that high. But now let's look at the python, classic example of an invasive species. How did it get introduced? Pets. People bring them in as pets. They get to a certain size, and people say, I don't want them anymore. People get divorced. They're like, honey, I don't want the snake. I don't want the snake. And instead of just killing the snake or giving it to a zoo, they go, you know what? Let's just let it go. Poor thing. That's a horrible, horrible idea. But unfortunately, this happens all too often. Now, what happens is they get out of the environment, and guess what? They're great at hunting. It's like, you know what? I used to eat these birds back in Asia. These birds will work just fine here in America. So they're quite adept at catching prey in their new environment. Uh, the way they build their nests in order to reproduce, not a problem in their new environment. So that's not a restriction. And then what happens is once they get to be, they grow pretty rapidly and they quickly get big enough that the normal things that would hunt snakes in their environment can't hunt them anymore. So once that happens, man, away they go. And their numbers they just reproduce at their biotic potential, and they just keep going until they cause pretty significant harm to the native species in their area. So here's why these are problems. Okay. So one of the main things is that they will outcompete the normal species in that ecosystem. So it causes a huge ecosystem disruption. This ecosystems have evolved. Every organism in it has a certain niche that it fills, and all of a sudden, here comes this invader, and it takes away a lot of food resources and can cause a lot of other species to go extinct, especially endemic species that are highly, highly evolved to a specific niche. And now that food source is gone, or that nesting source, whatever, is gone, and they go extinct. Another thing is they can also significantly alter the environment. So this is kudzu. You can see what happens. It tends to, it's a vine that tends to blanket everything like something from outer space almost. And so all the plants and animals and stuff that would be growing in this forest, they're just not going to make it anymore. Okay, so it alters the environment. How do they get there? Well, one of the classic ways that they get moved around is what's called the ballast water of ships. So when a ship is offloading its cargo, it becomes top heavy, and so in order to keep that from happening, they bring water on board. They call it ballast water. My son has to be in charge of doing this with the ship he works on. It's pretty technologically tricky, but you bring water on, it keeps the ship from tipping over. Well, you're not just bringing on water, you also bring on aquatic organisms from whatever environment you happen to have your boat in at the time. Well, then what happens is when you unload, when you get to new port, if you start to load more cargo in, then you don't want your ship to sink, so you got to get rid of some of that water. And unfortunately, you're not just getting rid of water, you're also getting rid of some of these organisms. So it turns out, at least for the U.S. Coast Guard, they require ships to purge and refill their ballast tanks when they're in the open ocean, so they can't end up impacting the. So, like if you're in Tokyo, you're not allowed to just come into San Francisco Bay anymore. You have to change out your water in the middle of the ocean before you get to our coastal waters. So you're protecting us from these invasive organisms, which this has been a main way that they've gotten around, at least the aquatic ones. Here's a classic example of an invasive species. It's called the Asian carp or the silver carp, but there's other ones as well. So basically, these things were brought from China intentionally in the 1970s, early 80s, in order to keep down algae populations in aquaculture operations, so fish farms for catfish here in Louisiana. And basically, these catfish operations, they would build like a large holding pen for them. You need water. And so what they do is they bring water in from the Mississippi River, and then water flow out, so you have a constant source of water. But the problem is they feed the fish. There's too much nutrients in there. Algae starts to grow. It can cause a problem called eutrophication, which makes the oxygen go down. So the solution these people came up with is, hey, I'm going to bring in these carp. They like to eat algae. They're really good at it. So they brought them in. All was fine until a flood happened, and then that species got loose into the Mississippi waterway. They began to reproduce. Well, it turns out they quickly outcompeted most of the other fish in the watershed. They reproduced. They're an R-selected species. They reproduced very quickly. Lots of algae for them to eat, and they grow very quickly, like the pythons. So they quickly became too big for other species to eat them, and now they have completely ruined most of the native fisheries along this huge chunk of America. Basically, everywhere that drains into the Mississippi River has this problem. And one of the big worries right now, and it hasn't happened yet, but it's going to, is the Great Lakes fisheries. Right now, they don't have them, but they will. And so they've set up these elaborate, like where there's canals that connect them, right? So what's keeping the fish from going to these canals? Where they put these electrocution things, like these shock, these voltage sources to shock the fish as they try to go through there, right? This gauntlets of electrocution. But the problem is people take boats, right? So a person eventually what's going to happen is someone's going to drive their boat in the Mississippi River or the Illinois River, whatever. They're going to accidentally pick up some eggs from these carps. They'll stick to their boat. They'll put their boat. They won't wash their boat properly like they're supposed to. They'll put it in the water here, and they will get loose. It's going to happen. It's almost impossible to make it stop happening, and it's a real problem. If you don't believe it's a real problem, you need to watch this video. I'm just going to play a moment of it. I'm going to mute it, but I really strongly encourage you to go and watch the whole thing with the explanation, all that on the presentation I put together. But I just want you to see a little bit about this, okay? So let's just see here. All right, you won't believe this when you see what really happens. Look at this. The Asian carp just go nuts, and they jump out of the water in the multitudes. It's just unbelievable. And so most of the central part of the United States is just full of these things, and there's so many of them. They just outcompeted all the other native fish in there. It's been a huge, huge ecologic catastrophe that was a result of an invasive species. Okay, thanks for watching. See you in class.